Welcome to the deep dive. If you really want to understand when America sort of became, well, modern America, you've got to look closely at the Gilded Age. Not just the big names, the Carnegies and Rockefellers, but the millions of ordinary people whose labor actually built those empires. So today we're diving deep into a stack of sources. We're tracking these huge movements of people. Folks coming across ocean, sure, but also moving within the country. Our mission is to get a handle on the massive forces, the push and the pull that reshaped everything.
And yeah, before we get into those forces, it's really important to see that our sources are actually telling two kind of parallel stories of movement happening simultaneously.
Right.
You got immigration, right? People coming from abroad, huge numbers, mostly Europe and Asia during this time. But then there's migration, just as important. That's people moving inside the U.S. And probably the most critical example here is the massive movement of African Americans out of the South after Reconstruction ended. Both threads, immigration and migration. They created this society that was, yes, way more diverse, but also almost instantly much more divided socially and economically.
Right, that division, that stratification. It seems like it started with, well, immense pressure cooker situations overseas, but also this sort of glittering promise of America. Let's dig into the international side first. The pull factor seems obvious, right? Industry.
Exactly. Expanding industries were like magnets. You know, cities needed workers for factories, mills, mines. It was this promise of steady work, something that just wasn't available for many back in, say, parts of Europe.
And the push factors from Europe, they seem really intense in the sources. It wasn't just one thing.
Not at all. It was a mix. Widespread poverty, definitely. Overcrowding in cities and rural areas, lack of jobs. It really pushed people to look elsewhere.
But sometimes it was more than just economic hardship, wasn't it? The
Yeah.
sources really highlight sheer survival as a motive for hundreds of thousands.
Absolutely critical point.
Yeah.
We're talking about, for instance, Jewish immigrants fleeing the Russian Empire. They weren't just seeking a better job. They were running from organized violence, the pogroms, often state-sponsored. For them, America wasn't just opportunity, it was refuge, survival.
And layered onto that, there was also this desire, it seems, to escape really rigid social structures.
Yeah, that comes through too. You know, escaping class systems where you felt kind of stuck from birth.
Yeah.
They were looking for that American idea, maybe idealized,
Yeah.
of a meritocracy, a fair shot, even if the reality, well, didn't always match the promise.
It's fascinating, though, how different the drivers look when we shift focus to internal migrants, especially African Americans in the Exoduster movement. It wasn't primarily about factory jobs, was it?
No, not primarily. For the Exodusters, the push was overwhelmingly about escaping profound injustice. Reconstruction had failed, Jim Crow laws were locking in segregation, voting rights were being systematically stripped away, and then there was a constant threat, the terror, from groups like the Ku Klux Klan.
So the South wasn't just a place with limited opportunity, it was actively dangerous.
Lethally dangerous for many. So the pull towards the West, places like Kansas, was less about finding a specific job and more about finding safety, autonomy, the chance to own land, breathe free air. You know, it was fundamentally about escaping oppression.
Okay, so we've got these powerful forces at play, economic pulls internationally, and this urgent push for basic safety driving internal migration. Where did all these people actually go? Who were they?
Well, looking at the Europeans first. Initially, the flow was more from Northern and Western Europe. You know, Irish, Germans, Scandinavians. Familiar groups from earlier waves.
But that changed during the Gilded Age, right?
It really did.
Yeah.
Later on, you see this massive surge from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Greeks, Poles, Russians, people from the Balkans. It's a huge demographic shift happening relatively quickly.
And what about immigrants from Asia?
Right. On the West Coast, you had Chinese immigrants who'd been arriving since the gold rush, joined by increasing numbers of Japanese laborers as well, different origins, but often heading to similar types of destinations.
Which were mainly cities.
Overwhelmingly cities. For Europeans, especially those arriving on the East Coast, the big destinations were the industrial hubs. New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh. If you landed on the West Coast or came from Asia, cities like San Francisco or Tacoma up in Washington were major centers.
And for the Exodusters, the internal migrants, you mentioned Kansas.
Kansas was the main destination, yeah. Estimates suggest around 40,000 black Southerners made that journey west. Significant numbers also went to places like Oklahoma and Colorado.
40,000. That's a huge act of collective will.
It really is. And while the dream for many was owning land, setting up homesteads, that autonomy we talked about, the reality, according to the sources, was that many ended up in towns and cities too. They took jobs as domestic servants, laborers, sometimes skilled trades if they could find the work. It wasn't an easy transition.
So all these movements converge on the cities, and that influx just completely transforms urban America, doesn't it? It creates a whole new kind of city.
Fundamentally, you see this physical sorting of people by class that just wasn't there in the same way before the Civil War. Back then, rich and poor often lived, well, closer together, maybe on the same block even.
But the Gilded Age changes that. How?
Technology plays a role. Streetcars, commuter rail. Suddenly, the middle class and the wealthy could afford to move out. They could live in quieter, leafier areas of first real suburbs and still commute into the city for work.
Leaving the central city areas behind.
Exactly. And the result is that these older central urban cores become almost exclusively the domain of the working class and the poor. And crucially, that's where most new immigrants ended up living.
And the conditions in those urban cores. The sources paint a pretty grim picture.
Oh, absolutely grim. The sheer number of people overwhelmed, the housing, the sanitation, everything. We're talking about incredibly overcrowded tenements, often shoddily built, terrible ventilation, little access to clean water, just breeding grounds for disease.
You got cholera, tuberculosis.
Those were rampant. The sources document devastating outbreaks that swept through these neighborhoods again and again. The human cost of this rapid, unplanned urbanization was just staggering.
It sounds almost unbearable, but people didn't just endure it, did they? They responded. They built things.
That's the really crucial part. Amidst these incredibly tough conditions, you see the rise of these vibrant ethnic enclaves, neighborhoods built around shared identity, shared culture, shared language.
Little Italy, Chinatown,
Yeah,
those kinds of places.
precisely. And there was so much more than just places to live. They were survival mechanisms. Think about it. Irish immigrants arrive. They establish Catholic churches, schools. Eastern European Jews built synagogues, community centers. These institutions anchored people in a new, often bewildering land.
So they preserved culture, but also provided practical support.
Absolutely. Little Italy in New York, for example, wasn't just pasta and feast days. It had Italian-language newspapers, social clubs, mutual aid societies. Polish downtown in Chicago had its own network of churches, schools, fraternal organizations that provided everything from insurance to political mobilization.
And that support network must have been even more critical for groups facing intense prejudice.
Definitely. Look at Chinatown in San Francisco or Japantown in Tacoma. Facing virulent anti-Asian racism and discriminatory laws, these enclaves provided essential economic support, places to speak your own language, and networks for mutual aid. They organized, they built community banks, groceries, political groups to fight for their rights. It was resilience in action.
It's not always just separation, though, right? Sometimes these pressures create interesting blends.
That's a great point. Ybor City, down in Tampa, Florida, is a fascinating example. It was huge for cigar making. And you had Cuban, Spanish, and Italian workers all living and working side by side very closely.
Sharing the same factories, the same neighborhoods.
Exactly. And that close proximity, that shared experience of tough working conditions, it actually forged a unique blended culture. And interestingly, made Ybor City a real hotbed for labor organizing. They found common cause across ethnic lines.
Wow, okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here in this deep dive. We've looked at the huge economic and cultural forces pushing people out of Europe and Asia, and that desperate need for safety driving the exodusters, all 40,000 of them west.
And how all that movement fundamentally remade American cities, created these dense, often segregated urban cores filled with working-class folks, immigrants, internal migrants.
But also places of incredible resilience and community building.
That's the key takeaway, I think. The Gilded Age didn't just build factories. It built this new kind of American city, segregated, yes, facing immense hardship, yes, but also home to these incredibly vibrant, self-sustaining communities, forged right in the heart of it all. 40,000 exodusters seeking safety, millions seeking opportunity. It changed everything.
So here's something to chew on as we finish. Think about that move, the middle class, the wealthy, moving out to the suburbs, creating that physical distance from the urban core. How might that separation, that literal distance, have affected the political will, or lack thereof, to address the terrible conditions, the disease, the poverty faced by the working class and immigrant communities left behind in the city centers? Something for you to consider.